Okay, so there's like a whole other aspect to this that I'm thinking about now, which is like not really working with quantize, you know? Um, some people feel like quantize is a crutch, and I think that's kind of a dumb thing to think because, like, at the end of the day, it's like nobody cares how you got to your end result, right? So, if you used quantize to make something awesome, like, who cares, you know? But at the same time, there are certain like rhythms and grooves that they don't call for quantization, you know, like because the bane of quantizing everything is that you get things sounding super stiff, robotic, and too perfect, right? Which is kind of the opposite of what like most real drummers are doing. You know, even the smallest nuances make for a lot of character in a rhythm. Um, so there are a lot of grooves that you just can't quantize per se. You know, it's going to take the life and the character out of what you're doing. And then there are certain grooves where you can kind of find a middle ground. So I did an old video, I don't know, several months back, maybe towards the beginning of the year, I don't even remember. And it was like a couple of simple approaches to getting like Dilla kind of grooves. So I feel like if we cover that really quickly here, that's kind of an example of where you could use quantizing and non-quantizing to get some kind of a cool hybrid groove. So let's go ahead and set our BPM to 90, which is kind of like a classic boom bap tempo. And all I'm going to do is something like this. Right? Super simple. And we're going to quantize those so they're right on grid. Nobody's impressed by that, but that's okay. And then what you could do is just play your hi-hats in raw and don't quantize them and try to get those to be the organic element of your groove that brings all the swing and character to the groove, you know? So let's try something. So we have this like really kind of nicely swung groove, but the kicks and snares are right on the grid, right? And all of our swing and groove information is really just coming from the hi-hats. Hey, yeah. And I love that feel. So that's like a good example of where you could kind of use a combination of quantizing and then just your raw performance to come up with an interesting groove. Let's just for sake of showing you again, let's try a slightly different hi-hat groove here. So that's something you can definitely experiment around with. Very helpful for like making something that has the underlying structure and consistency here, where our kicks and snares are right on grid. And then you can kind of get loosey goose with it with something like the hats or rides or whatever it might be. And then let's say you have something like that, like you could go back in and experiment with different like ghost notes on like your kicks or snares. And you can leave those unquantized as well, and that can bring another dimension of swing to what you're doing. Know what I mean? So again, you're gonna have to experiment around a lot with this type of stuff. And eventually you're going to build a library or a repertoire of different rhythms and grooves, and you're inevitably going to find yourself gravitating towards certain grooves. And for me, I just love these kind of like swung kind of Dilla rhythms. So that's a huge part of my rhythmic vocabulary. But you gotta. There's no getting around the fact that you're gonna have to do a lot of experimenting. But hopefully, this can kind of show you that it's not as like it's not as much of a mind game as you as people might think it is. You know, it's actually pretty simple most of the time in a lot of ways. So that's like hybrid stuff, and then the last method I suppose would be like doing things that are not quantized at all, and that's obviously going to be the most difficult thing to pull off. But if you can do it right, then you're going to capture way more of an organic feeling to your rhythms, right? Um, let's say our loop is this long, right? Using this yellow bar up here as our the length of our loop. If you're trying to do a super long loop and keep your groove consistent while also not quantizing it, trying to keep it organic, the probability that you're going to get out of like time with yourself is a lot higher. So what I found is if I want to do a really organic, like unquantized groove, I will reduce the size of my loop, sometimes down to something ridiculously small. Um, and that way there's less of a chance that I'm going to get out of sync with myself. And oftentimes when I've been calling that like the micro loop method. And oftentimes when I do that, the only thing I'll really quantize is my first kick, just to make sure that that's always right on point. Every time it loops back on itself, that's kind of like your anchor point. And it lets you know if things are looping properly. So let's try like a little micro loop real quick. We're going to go even smaller. And when I'm doing these, a lot of times I'll just like get really loose with it, experiment around and see if I can find little micro loops that feel good looping back on themselves. That was kind of a lucky, because a lot of the times it's just like, I don't know. You don't know if these things are going to work out. It depends if you're playing to a click or not. But yeah, so I'll just like quantize my first kick. And so that's a little micro loop that happened to work out. And none of that is quantized except for my first kick, right? So if I get a little micro loop like that I see potential in, and I like the way that it loops back on itself, oftentimes what I'll do is duplicate that. And then in the second half, I'll add some kind of variation, whether that's adding an element or like actually getting rid of things. So we could do something like this. You know what I mean? Yeah. So a lot of the times actually getting rid of elements is a cool, I don't know, it's awesome. But sometimes you want to just add more variation or add new parts to that loop. So there we added a little snare roll and then just like one extra little kick here. And now we have this super like organic drum loop that just sounds awesome. And it's something that you would be super hard pressed to come up with if you were like trying to think super methodically about it or trying to use quantize settings, So again, as long as your first kick is right on grid, and then as long as the loop loops back on itself nicely, a lot of what happens in the middle can be really loose, and you can get away with a lot of crazy rhythms in the middle, Like this groove right here is ridiculous. So I mean, again, you could take, because that loops on itself nicely, you could duplicate that again and then add more variation on the second half. Maybe I'll do let's see, maybe I'll do something like this. Let's do like a kick and open hat. You know what I'm saying? And then I'm just gonna quantize that first kick again, so everything's looping back on itself real nicely. And now we've got a sweet drum loop, and it was not super hard to make, and it's all very organic. It's got a nice human organic swing to it, So yeah, that would be like kind of the third method that I often use if I'm going for a really organic type of sound. So the first video, right, we walk through like basic drum programming things utilizing quantization, and then in this video, just to recap real quickly, we went through like the hybrid where you're quantizing some things and leaving other things raw and organic. And in this last method, we just do things with no quantize other than our first kick, and that gives you a whole host of other results too. So between those three different processes, that kind of encapsulates my whole like process for coming up with drum parts, whether that's like a crazy jazz fusion thing, whether that's kind of like a hip hop thing, or anywhere in between. So hopefully this kind of helps like maybe break down some of the barrier to entry like fear that people have when like getting into finger drumming, whether that's like on keys or the like a MIDI pad thing, like an MPC. I actually I think I don't have experience with the like an MPC drum pad type thing, but I think from watching other people use those that it's probably more intuitive and maybe even just easier physically to use those. But if you're determined to make some cool drum parts with like a MIDI piano, you can totally do that. So yeah, let's go. Let's go.